All right, we are going to get started. It's great to see you all here. My name is Robin Kelsey, and I'm the Burden Professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture. And with the tremendous support of the Mahindra Humanities Center, Susie Clark, Steve Beal, Mary McKinnon, and others, we have been putting on this Environment Forum for what shocks me to say 8 years now. Ian Miller of the History Department and I initiated the Environment Forum in September of 2016. And our sense at that moment was that the sprinkling of the humanities around the university into conversations dealing with climate and the environment was not sufficient, and that we wanted to bring our environmental concerns to the center of what we do in the humanities. And the aim really was not to make our environmental situation yet another field or interest or theme or topic within the humanities, but rather to ask more fundamentally, what is it that humanists might do? What should humanists do in light of the tremendous environmental predicament in which we find ourselves? Our first speaker in September 2016 was Terry Tempest Williams, and since then we have been joined by a remarkable series of interlocutors, including Robin Wall Kimmerer, Richard Powers, Taya Miles, Jed Purdy, Roy Scranton, Neil Amrith, Bathsheba DeMuth, Gary Paul Nabhan, and many others. Tonight, it is our great pleasure to have as our guest Ranjan Ghosh. Professor Ghosh teaches in the Department of English at the University of North Bengal, although he has held visiting professorships in various countries around the globe. He is a prolific author. In addition to his scores of articles, Professor Ghosh has written and edited a great number of books, including a trilogy that he's at work on in a field he has helped to mold, we might say, plastic studies. His book, The Plastic Turn, was published by Cornell in 2022. Second book in the trilogy, Plastic Figures, is slated to be published by Cornell next year. And then there's a third book planned, Plastic Humanities, which we look forward to as well. In the meantime, he has recently published with Oxford, I think within the recent days, a book called Plastic Tagore, which is not a part of the trilogy, but clearly a part of the larger interest in plastic studies. But Professor Ghosh has also published widely on various literary subjects, and I will just single out the volume Thinking Literature Across Continents, a dialogic meditation on why literature matters, which he co-wrote with the recently departed J. Hillis Miller. And that book came out from Duke in 2016. Professor Ghosh has been festooned with many awards and distinctions, including being named an Alexander Humboldt Fellow in 2007 and recently elected to the European Academy of Arts and Sciences. And following his talk, we will have a conversation and take questions. So please, as you listen to his presentation, think about what you might want to ask. And with that, I will ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Ghosh to the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center.
Good evening, and thank you everyone who have found this time and space to come down and for this talk here. And before I begin, of course, I would like to thank Mahindra Humanities Center, Susan Clark, Steve Beal, who's sitting there, right there at the end, Robin Kelsey, and Mary McKinnon, all of you. I really thank you and of course, Karen Thornber. I can see you there as well. Thank you for coming, Karen. I begin this talk in the next 45 minutes that I'm going to talk. Please have patience because there are certain things that I have to show. And of course, I have to go on with this talk. I'll be slow in rhythm because there are certain things that I want to talk about, what it actually means by plastic nature. Obviously, one line of interpretations, but I would love to have a nice discussion after this so that there are other avenues that can be explored. Let me begin with the controversy. It's a granite controversy as against plastic controversy. In June 1833, Charles Darwin asked the captain of HMS Beagle to delay the departure from Tierra del Fuego because a strange group of granite boulders had starred his investigative and imaginative energy. One of these, shaped somewhat like a burn, was 47 feet in circumference and projected 5 feet above the sand beach, he later wrote. This is the granite boulders. So in his accounts of the voyage, Darwin described crystalline boulders of notable size and abundance near Barrio San Sebastian, south of the Strait of Magellan. Darwin was curious about the shape of the boulders and could not understand how they got there. And this intense interest in granite is an expression of his geological and romantic imagination. It brought surprise. Those large masses of rocks were later called Darwin's boulders, erratic and enigmatic, speculative and romantic. Geologically, Darwin attributed the erratic to ice rafting, but their enormity and strangeness added to their wild beauty, and they ignited Darwin's post-Lyell geological temper and imagination. Then came the word bizarre, or the bizarre. Granite has its own complicated formations, unstable and not simple in its petrological origin, as the granite controversy attests. It is consisting of known materials yet combined in a secret manner. It is impossible to determine whether its origin is from fire or water. Extremely variable in the greatest simplicity, its mixture presents innumerable combinations. Third quality, becoming. The granite genesis has its competing explanations. It was magmatic. Well, granites are igneous rocks resulting from the crystallization of magma, and metamorphic, where granites are the result of a dry or wet granitization process that transforms sialic sedimentary rocks into granite, because granites are the result of ultrametamorphism involving melting, which you can say the anatexis of crustal rocks. Now, Goethe on Granite, the essay that he writes in 1784, speaks about the antiquity of Earth, a nearly unfathomable processual build-up within the Earth's crust, the romantic and scientific imagination in a becoming Earth. He observes that composed of familiar materials formed in mysterious ways, its origins are as little to be found in fire as they are in water. Extremely diverse in the greatest simplicity, its mixtures are compounded in numberless variety. So granite has its own mix of quartz, feldspar, mica, and Goethe observed in his essay on geology, particularly the Bohemian, in which he tried to analyze the mysterious trinity of these three materials. The solidity, interestingly, conceals a fluidity of coming together, which you might say a kinesis in mineralization. The fourth term, conglomerate. Now, these granite boulders are neither conceived in terms of static form nor in terms of the anteriority of ruins, but rather in terms of an ongoing movement of ruination. Rather than as a substance, granite is presented as a thing in motion. Goethe's sensitivity to art formations is revealed in his principle of incongruence, in which the earth is left to transform and transit in a complex geoerotics. Reflecting on such mineral mactans, stones and rock formations present themselves, express themselves, transform themselves, let themselves be seen, produce themselves, spread themselves out, alter themselves and conceal themselves. In this drama of things, mineral agents take humans as accusative objects. They direct our attention, they address us, they come together to make formations. But the fascination and fetish, the imagination and indignation today is with plastic, not granite. And an aggrieved and aggressive turn to plastic has brought us not before granite or Darwin's boulders, but a strange petrichor, which is called the plastiglomerate. Here is it, the plastic rocks, where the plastic has got inside indentured into the rock's surface. It's a mixture of plastic intermateriality, and I use the 4 adjectives that I used previously: surprising, bizarre, becoming, erratic, and aberrant. So like granite, this is called plastic controversy. Granite and the plastigomerates are deeply embedded, each in their own way, poesis in petrology and the petrochemical. Plastic was formed a little more than 100 years ago. It was made formative and formable. Finally, it forms itself. Today, like Darwin's and Goethe's granite, plastigomerate, plastic and conglomerate coming together, plastigomerate comes through as a romantic rock, speculative and spectacular, with its distinct geological aesthetic. Like Goethe's erratic granite and Darwin's errant boulders, plastigomerate as an idiorhythmic emergence signals a fresh poesis in geological thought, geopoetical thought, and the lithospheric imaginary. Living through inhuman time, we are attuned to a non-human surge and profusion both on land and in water. Humans had their event with plastic, and now the whole of Earth is an event itself. If granite is the ur stone, plastigomerate is the novice stone, the controversial stone. One demonstrates geological plasticity, granite, and the other is a kind of plastic materialization, both attesting to an extraordinary geological becoming. Here is another image. This is a plastic presence that you see in the rocks in the Trinidad Islands off the coast of Brazil. That's the image. It almost looks like a crocodile. Now, plastigomerate, this newfound georeality, is a product of hardened, molten, plastic-holding sediment, basaltic lava fragments and organic debris, natural debris and sedimentary grains. If sedimentary or igneous rock speaks about the impact that a changing Earth had on its own formations, plastigomerate leaves behind the traces of a predatory human species and what it did to extinguish itself through an invention that ensured an eventual ruin. Both Patricia Concornon and Charles Moore, the 2 people who actually discovered this plastigomerate, admit that plastic melts beyond recognition in some plastigomerate, and in some it is still visible and recognizable in the form of netting ropes, pellets, partial containers, packaging, leads, tubes, pipes, confetti. And that is how it's been recognized. So these are called the embrittled remains in the form of containers and leads, as I said, ropes, nylon fishing line, and parts of oyster spacer tubes that countenance the rock identity. So if granite grew out of a blend of quartz, feldspar, and mica, as I mentioned earlier, building its own mineralization with certainty and mystery, then the materials identified in the formation of the plastigomerate, they speak of a larger story of civilization and its discontents, and of a febrile controversy in the making. You call it a kind of junk-eared Frankenstein. In the spirit of transcendental geology, standing on ground that has always been a dynamic ungrounding, we are left to ask, will legacy leave humans in the rocks? As plastic is made to sieve through into the remotest non-human corners of this planet, the subterranean infiltration is no less emphatic, and we can call it plastiturbation. Within anthropogenic morphostratigraphy, we have human inputs influencing sedimentation and the lithoscape. Imagine reading the plastic nature in a future textbook. Like this is an artwork by Judith Selby, an artist, American artist, but this is probably going to read later, almost in a proleptic way. The plasticine discontinuity, as you see there, and I read out how might the future of plastic textbook might read. The history of the earth can be read in the pages of geologic layers, built-up sediments, igneous volcanic flows, rocks stacked and folded until strata are formed. Each layer deciphered is an understanding of a past moment of natural history. In the year 2855, a startling discovery was made that unfolded the mystery of what happened over 10,000 years ago, revealing clues of what happened in our time our popular press has come to call the Age of Grease. It was a time when fossil fuels were sucked out of the earth, dug out of the earth to drive a civilization towards its demise. A layer of brilliantly colored substance was found sandwiched between layers of rock, substances that civilization called plastic. That's the future book that I'm writing here. The layer which is so distinctive that our geologists and archaeologists have come to call it a discontinuity, a term used to non-conforming conditions. Now, this interesting part of this development is in seeing how rocks that signaled inhuman time come to be humanized through the material remnants of a particular species called the human. If geological imagination aspires to make scalar and stratigraphic developments comprehensible to us, plastiglomerate evokes a new imagination that projects its own post-Anthropocenic potentials, that is, a future that will talk only about the past. I call this plastifossilization. And this plastifossilization is a relentless and inexorable process that recharacterizes an already unstable Earth that is a compilation machine, an assembly line where trash, construction debris, coal ash, dredge sediments, petroleum contamination, green lawns, decomposing bodies, and rock ballast not only alter the formation of soil, but themselves form soil bodies, and in this respect are taxonomically indistinguishable from soil. So plastic seepage and sedimentation keep changing the soil's character and habit. I call this plasticization of soil ego, to create a deterritorialized earth weighed down by irrevocable plastic sink. Earth's deep time, hence, is increasingly invaded by plastic time. Besides its non-plasticity and decay-resistant trajectory, this plastic time includes forces that are global, capitalist, and economic and political. The processes that make the Earth's crust chemicalize differently involve a temporality of a different order, as soil organisms, including plants, face a different order of existence and expiry. Whether other fossilizations generated interest in the Earth depths, teleplastic fossilization has left us frozen in options. We have no other options. Deposition is depravity, and consequences are controversial. Plastiglomerate announces no abrupt collapse of time and historical distance in understanding. It speaks of a clear trajectory of evolution, even in the last 60 years, wedging the subject and the object together. The anti-romantic formulation of reversal of subjectivity, where the object formation has its own precise scientific understanding and clear heuristic discourse on the relational map with a transforming sub-object. Plastic geolayering has its own telematic genealogy. It is here that a controversial parallelism builds between plastic materiality and biological plasticity, where running away from plastic is always already a running into plastic. The plastic hardwaring of Earth develops its own vanishing and expiry points, points of sustainability, composite fractures, a kind of variantology. So the plastic objects swept up and unearthed reveal the threshold points of anthropogenic understanding of Earth and its elementality and phenomenality. It is in the exceeding of the scope of human knowledge and the systems of representation where we find there is an excess of the earth. And there is the elemental in the earthwork that encourages a fresh sense generation where nature comes to create its own forms of representation and challenge our limits of understanding about what makes an intelligible form. Plastic nature never returns to itself, it merely returns. It is strange to itself and has become its own authority. The plastic stones and the GOC profile come to reinforce our sheltering in the elemental. As Professor John Sallis points out, philosopher John Sallis points out that fleeing to one's home as the storm approaches does not allow one to escape from the storm, but only to shelter oneself from its force. Cultivating the field, fishing the sea, cutting wood in the forest do not open a path beyond the field, the sea, or the forest, but rather constitute a certain kind of human comportment to these elementals in which one is encompassed. Fleeing and staying away from plastic is to dwell in the plastic elemental. How does this connect with the sublime this plasticization produced? That's the second question. The thin sublime, as Sandra Shapsey explains, emerges from sources that are physiological and transcendental and owes to the allegiance to Edmund Burke and Kant. So she argues for a pre-theoretical form of appreciating nature, such that when caught up in such experiences, our attention is fixed on certain aspects of the natural expanse rather than others, like the palpable force of a cascade, its height, the volume of the water, the way it alters the surrounding atmospheres, etc. But this thin sublime does not require any specific scientific knowledge. Perhaps it only requires being human, equipped with the senses we have, being small and able to intuit the immense force relative to creatures like us of the roaring tons of waters. That is, we may be roused emotionally by nature, and our arousal may be the function of our human nature in response to natural expanse. But plastiglomerate opens up an aspect of the sublime that is less environment and more object processed. There is the thick sublime now. This thick sublime here calls on reason, rational reaction, and greater cognitive content. Look what plastic has done in such beautifully horrific ways without our knowledge at first, imperceptibly and now unavoidably, with such lethal seepage and eventual toxicity. It looks very nice, actually, this one. It is not a pain or exaltation that would need a Kant or a Schopenhauer to explain and paradigmatize. This is not a strict dynamical sublime, but has a certain intensity of emotion that derives from fragility and precarity of human relationship with nature. It brings more idea and intellection into our understanding of object and the object processuality, and is the process by which scientific cogniticism itself invites a certain attention to the framing subject. A sublime art event through plastiglomerate makes the aesthetic appreciator take some notice of the relationship between the subject who frames and appreciates aesthetically and the environment to which she attends. Thus, in attending to a natural environment, it seems perfectly legitimate, even in some cases required, to appreciate the fact both that the subject is part of that environment physically and provides the frame for her experience of the environment. That's exactly what you get. So what process enmeshed the toothbrush or the nylon rope to come with the rock? What brought them together? What force and instance synergized plastic and rock, the temperature gradient and molecularity, the seepage and the conjugation? The transcendence of plastiglomerate into an aesthetic object, as much as a scientific wonder, effective cognitive, imaginative intellective, inspires a thick sublimity. It is a sublime that has found a place. This is earth, othered. The interlocking of matter is unstable, unpredictable, and dynamic. If plastic claims its way into the digestive system of a fish and clangs out of space in the human body, it clings to rocks in exquisitely esoteric terms and forms too. Earth delivers the unknown, and in that sense, an unknown experience. The images of the plastiglomerate and the old plastics speak of a defeated imagination because they emerge from unrest. In line with Edgar Allan Poe's dark sublime, these images depict an alternative world of ecological violence, the uncanny, and the unaccountability of experience itself. Our guilt, compulsive agency, habit, and dread are inscribed, fossilized deep into the face of the rocks. Plastic sublimity maladapts to a reality that to a large extent is of our own making. This keeps the shudder alive. They don't encourage a supersensible substratum in a Kantian way so as to overwhelm us. The intensity of the impact is more at the level of seeing a dissipation of energy and an entropic disrupture within a system. The violence in the visual beauty of the rocks is in a Poe-like way anti-sublime, a transcendent moment that reveals our overwhelming decay and destruction. The rocks alienate us from ourselves, from the plastic-habituated species like we are. They are a rupture in the formations of our subjectivities. The sublime effect of plastiglomerate then is dialectical. They take wonder, a vexatious experience, collapsing present concerns with future-oriented dread, evoking an emotionally complex fear of beauty, and raising the confusion that comes through the ascension of unreason. At the same time, the political in such ecological sublime cannot miss discoursing our ongoing existence with a commentary on the future and by passing a judgment. The political writes our history and our transpersonality with a nature that has its own, yet to be seen and heard, apocalyptic soundings. So the plastic controversy questions, how could a toothbrush or a nylon rope get into a particular rock? Here is a nylon rope that gets to the rock. How? How could a toothbrush or a nylon rope get into a particular rock? So what force and instant synergized with the melting of the rock, the temperature gradient, the flow, the molecularity, the seepage, and the conjugation? This interlocking of the matter is unstable. Plastic at large, in its non-laboratory avatar, is not limited to hylomorphic materialism. The turn to plastic has become a turn to composite plastic, dynamic multiform plastic, and non-structural plastic in the sense of exceeding forms beyond human cognition and imagination. How does the toothbrush we use relationalize with the frayed and frumpy toothbrush in the body of the plastiglomerate? Now, Jeremy Shripek points out that in hylioenergism, a material object is not itself an activity or process. It is something composed of matter, which comes into existence when that matter is engaged in certain activity or process. Understood mereologically, a material object is composed of both its matter and the activity or process that is occurring in that matter. So plasticofutures, through synchronic mineralization, reveal all plastic that infuse each other through substructural changes and processual energy. The figurality of plastic as an event, in the sense of a formation, and as an occurrence, as a state of occurring, emphasizes the endurantist account of the persistence of material objects. There is a chance. There is a chance in the indifference of old plastics, the objective chance, a sudden confluence point of contrasting objects. So it's the random in the process, causality, not without probability. If you mark the nylon-inscribed plastiglomerate closely, you find a displacement of agency that the invention of plastic 100 years ago had never envisaged. The nylon-stamped rock announces a distant human hand to it. It is both about how the earth separates from its inmates and from itself. Old plastic remind Earth how it can surprise itself, be its own cause of wonder. So isn't the plastic Earth, the plastic nature, controversial enough? Our presentness and reflexivity with plastic makes a different nature emerge. The product of a plastic anthropos, whose control over a material and a relentless and helpless capitulation to a material speak of a different political in the making. He is a nature's man in an ironical way. Through the adoption of the principle of maximum sustainable yield, the plastic anthropos is the object of a plastic nature in ascendance. When all escape routes from plastic are closed and well nigh impossible to conquer, our investment in plastic is sustained and self-consuming. We cannot ignore that we are entering into, as Boynil and Frizos argue, a new geohistorical epoch that signals the eruption of the earth, its temporality, its limits, its systematic dynamics, into what figures to be a history, an economy, and a society emancipating themselves from natural constraints. It signals the return of the earth into a world that Western industrial modernity, on the whole, represented to itself as above the earthly foundation. So if our future involves a geological swing of the earth into a new state, we can no longer believe in a humanity making its own history by itself. So plastic nature has changed our geo-respiration. I call it geophany in the sense of an epiphanous earth. And this geophany produces a new poesis and a praxis of listening. Plastic makes earth listen differently to a new anthropogenic production, as much as humans are seen to touch earth differently. Plastic technology, or plastic as technology, is the unavoidable connection that ensures the cosmos of our everyday in society, economy, and culture, and sunders us from the cosmos we choose for plastic to inhabit. It is a technological bias in serious irreversibility, where living is not without the exhaustion of what constitutes and supports living. Plastic pharmacology is our new reality. It is entropic in that the being and becoming are embedded in a discourse of present-future, toxicized by plastic, and the technological transcendence through plastic. We are making both. And here comes a love that de-individuates us, atomizes us against a transpersonal existence with our surroundings, our non-human life, outside the eros of a plastic ego. The vector of desire has changed, but the change comes on an axis that is difficult to enunciate. From desire for plastic to a desire against plastic without a helpless submission to the love for plastic, a very complicated psychosis. Plastic individuation is much more complex than we think it is. At the core of such a complex love is unfulfillment. The eros to crave for more plastic, riding on an unfulfilled desire, and the unfulfillment arousing out of an impossibility to eradicate plastic from one's life, both coming together. Plastic effect is living with an unfulfillment. Plastic enjoins and separates us at the same time. Plastic promotes interconnectedness, but it also cannot avoid promoting separation. Frederick Neurath sees ecology of separation as a contested principle, where he believes that interconnection must leave room for separation and must metabolize, symbolize, and recognize it if it is to avoid falling into the confusion resulting from the abolition of differences. This separation, in fact, helps us to understand our interconnection and intermeshed state of being in a better way. He notes that for an ecology of separation to be political, one needs to take into consideration the dangers which may threaten us to
to distinguish between that which humans may construct and that which cannot and should not be constructed, to know in what ways it is still possible to use the word nature and environment to enable the ecosystem to be resilient and to endure the disasters of the Anthropocene. Ecology must leave space for separation. Nerat opposes relentless constructivism that has a hegemonic hold over nature and ecology today. The ecologics of plastic is constructivist, but not without an imperative to judge it from a distance and a detachment that does not attenuate the politics of its status and being in the world. The complexity of the plastic nature is invested in intermateriality and a mediation coming from a split, let's say a cleavage, relating with plastic without an a priori investment and involvement. Living on this split has brought a plastic nature against a constructivist one, a nature technologized with a nature technologized with a nature that has built its own technitis and oriented its own technophilia like the plastiglomerate. This split takes constructivism to the other end of ecology, when nature separates itself from the human engineered nature and plastic mediates to accentuate that separation. No wonder we survive on the folds of a technical and natural nature that demands a separate ethics and sensitivity of understanding. Nerat's arguments for geoengineering as turning into a naturalist nature have their own force. Climate engineering, he writes, considers itself as ready to save the planet, even if we have to pay for it by way of some collateral damage, such as the periods of severe drought in equatorial Africa with certain uncertain parts of India. If terraformation and geoconstructivism are plastic-driven, how can we come out of a territorialized Earth and the increasing intricacies of geomaterial abiotic relationships? Clearly, plastic affect has thrown a dialectical nature to live and live for. It is not mourning over plastic, for plastic has become a life within a life, a nature within a nature, a death outside the conservative understanding of mortality. Earth is increasingly erratic and eccentric. Is nature too? We may argue that plastic unconstructible, as Nerat argues, is not what eludes all construction, but is the unassailable and the essentially terrestrial. Old plastics and whatever come undocumented and unprojected after them are the inaccessible transcendental production that Nerat calls the transcendental dark side or counterlining. That this transcendental is not strictly Kantian, but a constructible that by virtue of its inaccessibility and ungraspability is unconstructible. This unconstructible is not an event that took place just once at the origin of the world and its of things. It has been present throughout the entire history of the earth, connecting its past with its most distant future. This transcendental dark side or counterlining is the other side of the concrete history of the earth. Something is there that does not love being graphed and grasped. The eccentric earth or nature makes its own claims as the eccentric living bodies declare eccentricities that are not subjectified abnormalities, but are the counterlining. Plastiglomerates are formed under conditions of human use of plastic. The plastic unconstructible will emerge under the condition of the earth. Earth does not need to be thought as all anthropogenically constructed and consequently dependent solely on human effort for survival and sustenance. We can cut down on plastic, yet cannot be free from this material as it builds its organic and synthetic ties with an erratic and transcendent earth. So finally, plastic nature and plastic ecology figures the superhumanity by conceiving the man as a form of over-representation, which is about being outside oneself to survive and sustain. Being human is being caught in the existing ecology of things and understanding where decisions about the planet are made by humans. Judgments about the earth are based on calculation and possibilities adjudged by the humans. Plans about the climate are all too human to believe that it will not err. Coming out of the human is looking at the ecology differently. Ceasing to be the human is overcoming the nature conceived, exploited, and ethicalized by humans only. Foncia Laruelle's Lost Humanity leads me to believe how persons are humans and not human with H capital. The word enframed by a transcendental echo of crisis and endism is again reducing the ecologies to ecology, E capital. The task of facing the lost humanity, the last of our humanity, is to call forth another end of the world. Not its reform, not its descent into great barbarism, but an end of world as such in favor of a more open universe that includes a fragile and real earth. For me, it is living in the plastic earth, making sense of plastic nature or plastic natures. This earth figures a living not merely as more than human, but ceasing to be human. We have had the last human, the last humanity, and modeling on nature, plotting the science of living together, abstraction and subtraction that persevere with the former human, await a time where plastic ecology will set the note of living within the real, R capital. The real is the experience and the reality that cannot be etched out through scientific ecology and existential empiricism. The real of plastic ecology is a collapse of understanding. It is often the unstructured and the indeterminable category of understanding. Our history of living so far, the ecological ego, is simply about figuring the human first and the earth next. The human lived generically and indexed first, and then the sites of MAP, M-A-P, man, animal, plants. Plastic ecology messes up with this verticalization of existence, the surface and the ground of living. Perhaps the post-Darwin human figure is too complex to be itself. Nature has its plastic order, in that it adjusts and accommodates, turns and shapes in ways in which humans think they know and can predict always. However, it cannot predict what a plastic particle destined to survive in the next 400 years will do and how it may return to the human nature fold. This is the figural politics of a non-negotiatory nature. Plastic nature manifests a love for nature and natures that do not simply exist. Nature is not there for all. As displaced object of love, the phantasmatic desire to inhabit and harmonize, the green imaginary creates its ontological insecurity. We cannot resist to love, and yet in loving, we are fearful of its manifestations, its disclosive power in undesired and unfulfilled circles. In fact, is nature always a limit and never a reality to be conquered in full? The green reality, as I say, is inadequacy and inconsistency. Yet we try to understand the reality in ways that are only too human. Green then can be perceived as a dynamic absolute, with a morass of signifiers as anxiety, frustration, self-preservation, initiation, proactivism, control, governance, law, and nostalgia. We live in the green, yet green is always our other, disappearing, deranged, depend-worthy, and disjoint. It is both conscious, living through our effort to construct, commitment to greenify, to prevent a nature we think is disappearing, and then it's the unconscious, less a thought and more an experience in the being. This is the unknowingness of a green reality, that comes as a limit to the conscious, hence incomprehensible. The limit of the plastic green is both its affirmation and negation of reality. This is interesting because objectification of nature, its possession and control, comes with a lack, a deficit, a void, which every limit hides. Plastic nature becomes a montage of meaning, and the quilting points in biodiversity, ecocities, carbon dioxide, or climate change can make alliance for plastic figurations, resulting in a remainder or an excess that evades symbolization. Plastic nature discourses against depoliticized imaginary, one that, as Swingdidao argues, does not revolve around choosing one trajectory rather than another, one that is not articulated with specific political programs or socio-ecological projects. As such, the argument cuts across idiosyncrasies of often antagonistic human and non-human natures and their specific acting out, silences ideological and other constitutive social differences, and disavow democratic conflicts about different possible socio-ecological configurations by distilling a common thread to both nature and humanity. So plastic nature, as this talk with a certain line of interpretation shows here, is inherently political, a point of belonging, frequently a void, a specter of the unborn, and an indeterminate resolver of the biotic vagaries and emergences of the non-human other. Urging us to appeal to the pathologies of imagination, then, it is a project in motion. Plastic nature, as an incomplete project, is at once what it was never thought to be, and what is yet to come. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Shall we sit here?
Or should I answer from here? I'm more comfortable doing this.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm very comfortable.
Oh,
doing this,
okay.
yes.
That's fine. I could begin, but if others have questions, I see a hand already. Go ahead. Hi. Oh, yeah, sorry. Please wait for the mic.
Good evening. Thank you so much. What a fascinating dive into the world of plastic. My name is Amber Henry. I'm a Latin American anthropologist and new assistant professor here in African American Studies.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I'm curious, looking so deeply at plastic, I'm curious how unique plastic is, if there are other kind of agglomerates that emerged in your thinking about how this fusion between nature and non-nature. Of course, I'm thinking about Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy, and your work is in a way a new wave in looking at these other directions. So are there other elements that have kind of called to you and really looking at the shift between nature and non-nature dynamics? Thank you.
Well, it is, this is, that's the most important thing that I wanted to do here is whenever one actually starts to talk about plastic, the first thing that comes to your mind is plastic pollution. How plastic has, in a way, contaminated the entire world. What are the different threats that you are facing for plastic physiologically or clinically? But this was not really something that I wanted to do here. I wanted to give a different line of thinking, not necessarily that this is exactly what plastic nature is, because plastic nature would also include plastic pollution and all other environmental concerns that come with it. But my argument here was that, is plastic making us rethink the whole idea about the self and the other? Is plastic in a very mereological as well as a philosophical way is actually trying to create a kind of a distance that we have with us? Because when you look at this particular image, then you do not understand how actually this rock formation erupted. Neither do you, in a way, if you are a geologist. The most important thing is even a geologist or geomorphologist, whoever, they are actually trying to understand how this happens. So they are coming up with an explanation to say that these are exactly the reasons that probably led to this kind of an emergence or a formation. But interestingly enough, after having made that kind of a discussion or having made that kind of an interpretation, there is always, as I mentioned at the end of my paper, there is always a remainder and there is an excess, and that goes beyond the symbolization. So if there is a symbolization that comes through the geological understanding of how this rock formation takes place, the remainder or the excess is something that we have to live with. We have reached at a point where our entire existence with nature has been plasticized. Plasticized to a point, not with plastic material, but plasticized to a point where every understanding of nature has always come with a little bit of an excess and remainder. So all this unitary discourse about climate change and climate policy that we have, this unitary discourse is something that doesn't work, because our whole policy about carbon dioxide, or this, I call it the colonization of the Keeling curve. That Keeling curve is the kind of a colonization that we have. That doesn't really show that a carbon dioxide, the way the carbon dioxide actually trajectorially evolved, say from the 1958 down to 2024. This is not exactly how Earth goes. There is something about the Earth that comes through independence. There's something about the Earth that comes through its excess. So Earth is actually just not talking to the people who planetize or inhabit. Earth is also talking to itself. But at the same time, Earth has become a stranger to itself, because a granite or an igneous rock formation or a sedimentary formations, they had their own natural course of mineralization. But this is something that Earth never expected. So humans have a hand here, humans have a touch here, but it's a strange touch about which you don't know. So both the human and Earth, they are actually frightened as well as having a sublimic, wondrous time seeing what has been done to us. So Earth and the human, they are having a kind of an interesting collaboration between themselves. That was the argument, actually.
Other questions people have? Please wait for the mic. Thanks.
I'm standing here because I'm getting a good view of the audience, which is why. Or would you want me there? I think Robin missing me there.
Thank you very much. I'll make a stab at this, but it's still fuzzy in my mind. But you are starting with a kind of objectification of nature. You talk about a toothbrush. You talk about a rock, and then you go on to interpret it, and you give one kind of interpretation. Let's say what the geomorphologist said, and you say, well, that's not complete. You use the word excess. And of course, the geomorphologist would agree 100% with you. That's not a complete understanding. And I guess I'm wondering, let me, as a side, talk about another kind of fossilization that I'm more familiar with. So let's say during the Cambrian explosion, when shelled organisms, arthropods, mollusks, various things appeared for the first time in the record, and so the paleontologists go there, and they're not just interested in describing them. They want to know what these creatures did in their environment, and so they have to use analogies or comparisons with the living creatures, but still they go beyond that, and it's not just how they live, it's with whom they interact and with what they interact. If you want to distinguish those. And they're building up a story. Of course, it's not a complete explanation, but there's a framework that they come from. And so I'm wondering, what framework are you coming from? Not that it has to be a single framework, but I don't understand the framework you're talking about, because every discipline has its own admission that it's partial in its understanding. There's always excess. So how are you approaching this?
Okay. I completely agree that this is the interpretation that you gave here. This was actually one line of the interpretation, looking at a certain geoformation or looking at a certain geomorphological formation. And how the geomorphic formation actually speaks to us with its imagination, with its effect, and certainly with a kind of a human but not human symbolism. That was my argument. But yes,
When it comes to any kind of geological findings, it has a certain scientific procedure to go with. Because when this particular rocks are being found, it's found by a geoscientist, and they publish this in an article in the GSA, where from this article they first started to point out that what actually made those plastic rocks possible. So there is a clear, I did not say that because probably this scientific discourse getting very boring for many people here, but there is this very elaborate scientific way of explaining how this rocks came out. So there goes a clear strategy, at the same time a clear methodology by which you start to judge how this rock formations evolved. But my point here is that when I looked at it, I just brought in different disciplinary understanding of what you were wrong. One being that how can we understand through a philosophical sublimity? How can we actually look at this rock and think that whether it really becomes a kind of an earth art on itself? How can this object come out not just geomorphologically, not in a geological way, but can there be, as I use the term, geoerotics? You know, these are the terms that I've used here, or these are the conditions or the conditions of thought and discourses that I've brought in only to tell that whether we can have a different kind of an understanding of this particular event in its own form. I'm not in a way trying to explain it scientifically, because I can of course cite several journal articles that have actually explained how these rocks have come up. But you are right to say that when you have mentioned a particular rock like this, the ending of that article in the GSA tells you that there is something that yet the geologists are not being able to understand. So my interest actually went to that part of the reel where the rocks actually change themselves from just being a geological wonder or an object of geology, from being a kind of what you can say, a semiotic connector. When this rock starts to become a semiotic connector, bringing different kinds of signifiers into it, so that different kinds of understanding or responses can be developed. So it was a way of not denying any kind of methodology, because I know how these rocks came up and the scientific methodology that went into it, or the findings on the accuracy that went into it. But I just wanted to give these rocks a kind of an interpretation beyond their geological identity into a kind of a petri aesthetic identity. That was the real approach to the whole problem.
So that's why I talked about the Cambrian fossils.
Yes.
Because they are semiotic indicators, to use your language, if you wish. And scientists will acknowledge that.
Sure.
That is not novel.
That's
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yes, thanks for that fascinating lecture. Like somebody said here, my name is Adewale. I'm from the Mahindra Humanities Centers as well. I'm a research fellow. So like someone said the other time, you have introduced us into the plastic world, and I'm sure we're welcome with all our different views. I try to understand that you were giving us an idea of the even the plastic interpretation of plastic itself. Talking about plastic nature, you know, there were different shifting tones of interpretation about what plastic means. You know, you moved from science into philosophy and other different fields. And like you said, one particular statement actually, you know, catches my attention when you said nature has a plastic order. And I was wondering that you are able to move my understanding of plastic from material to immaterial, meaning that plastic, like you said, is a process of being and becoming. You use that word specifically. And I was now thinking that if plastic or plastic nature itself is a kind of relationality between humans and non-humans, and what, in the first place, predicates the ontology of the plastic? What is the essentiality of the plastic nature itself? Because if it has a particular XX or a particular essence, then it must be ontologically predicated on something. What exactly is that? I mean, if we take all the other genealogies of the scene, the Anthropocene, the Capitolocene, the Plantationocene, and all the other scenes, there's always something that predicates their ontological turn. What exactly predicates the ontological turn of the plastic nature? That's my first question. And the second one is has to do with, I don't know, maybe you would agree with this, that should we have the fear that a move towards the era of the Plasticine would also entrench the kind of self-order dichotomy we're trying to surmount in reality. Because that's always the case when you speak, for instance, from the point of, let me use the field I'm a bit familiar with, animal discourses, human-animal studies, when you begin to talk about seeking for autonomy, for absolute autonomy for animals, there's always a question of negating other non-human order that matters within reality. So we're talking about an era of plasticine. Is there not the fear of, entrenching back into a self-order dichotomy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. If I've understood you correctly, there are two things that I want to say very briefly. One is that this actually follows on the term that I introduced in the book, the plastic turn, because people actually started to tell me about that, why the turn again? Because we have already had a postmodern turn, a linguistic turn, and there are so many turns, neo-humanist turn, but why plastic turn? So my argument was, which was actually coming back to your question as well, to respond to your question as well, is that when I said plastic turn, I did not just mean that going to the plastic, that is everything has to go back to the plastic material and to see how the plastic material starts to impact on the environment or all other obvious disciplines that come with it, one of course being earth science. What I actually meant is very simple, to put it very simply, is this, that I am going to plastic to understand the material in relation to how it corresponds with our thinking in philosophy, arts, literature, and other disciplines. So is it that we are just not talking about the plasticity of a poem or the plasticity of a discipline? We are talking about how going back to the material, if you are turning to the material, how is it influencing your understanding of other disciplines? Because I haven't seen anyone writing on that so far. Because we are all talking about plasticity. If you go back to Catherine Malabou talking, she has spoken about philosophical plasticity and has explored the philosophical plasticity, whether it's through Hegel or Heidegger or Derrida. At the same time, the artificial intelligence and brain plasticity, as well as psychoanalysis. But here, what I'm trying to do is that I'm going back to the material, not just to tell you that this is what the material does to us. This is how it's actually, in a way, contaminates the soil profile. This is how it actually gets into our bodies. These are the things that it is doing damage to us physiologically. I'm not saying that, because I know I could have said that, but that would be something, I think, repeating someone's ideas, because I'm not qualified to say all these things in a different way. But what I wanted to do was that to go back to the material and see how the materiality of the matter starts to influence our understanding of a poem, maybe a work of art, maybe other disciplines like philosophy, how that correspondence works. So that was the turn I'm talking about. There is, what happens is that once you go back to the material, I will just about pursue this a little more so that my argument actually becomes clearer. For this, I had to do two things. One is that I'm a professor of literature, but my interest to write this book took me to working on polymer sciences. I went back to read polymer sciences and organic chemistry to see how does the plastic as a material starts to function. Because what is happening here is that when we are talking about plastic, our immediate interest is in the out of the laboratory plastic.
There are two kinds of ways of looking at plastic here. One is the inside the laboratory plastic, and other is the outside the laboratory. So our interest, if you are moving out of philosophical plasticity, look beyond Kant, Heidegger, or Malabou, then you have to see these two forms coming up, outside and the inside. The outside the laboratory plastic, I know I cannot actually meet with the kind of writing that is being done. Great work, great writings has been done on how it influences the carbonic economy, how is the carbon economy changing because of plastic, what are the damage that plastic does, and the rest of the things. I don't think I have the skill or I have the interest to do that. What I was interested in here, in this particular book, is to go back to see how plastic behaves in the laboratory. That is, how does a plastic molecule functions in the laboratory? Looking through chemical equations, looking through graphs, diagrams, illustrations, I started to find that out. And what I discovered was that there is a particular movement that this plastic molecule has. This polymerization of plastic, there is a certain movement, there is a certain way of functioning that was there. That interested me so much that I started making drawings. As a literature professor, thank God I didn't lose my job. So I started to do that. And as I started to work that out, I realized that there is a clear connection, a correspondence that I can draw with understanding of modernity and modernist literature, or studying of plastic art, like installation arts. And there I started finding a connection that can be done. So if you look up my book, The Plastic Turn, the first volume, then you would see that I'm reading a modernist poem, a very famous modernist poem by T.S. Eliot, The Westland. I'm reading that through the plastic polymer diagrams, that how those diagrams in the polymer molecules, they function to produce an interpretation of the Westland. So when I started to do that, I called it the plastic turn. I did not mean that I'm going to research on the plastic as the material. My interest was to go back to plastic in this way. So when I went back to plastic this way, to see how it actually affects a kind of an earthly surprise or produce a kind of an earthly sublimic emergence, I looked at this plastic as a turn to the earth, not really to explore how earth actually is getting deposited with plastic, or the plastic sink that completely moves into this earth to change the entire soil structure of the mineralization. That was not my interest. So this is the plastic turn that I wanted to explore. So the turn is on the material, and whatever way we look at other disciplines, whether it's a geological science, whether it's philosophy, or whether art or aesthetics, it always has to spring from the material itself. And to really, in a way, add something to this, just a sentence here. My next book that I'm writing that's coming out next year, The Plastic Figures, where I've spoken about other different things which might, of course, raise a lot of controversy. One is called The Plastic Translation, where I want to see how a plastic bottle that actually is thrown into the sea and it travels from, say, China to Helsinki, and that bottle actually travels, how does that create transcontinental post-colonial translation? How can we read post-colonial translation through the movement of the plastic bottle? So there's a different occasion to speak about that. If ever I get a chance, I'll certainly will. But that is how I'm looking at plastic at this moment. So that was the kind of relation to answer your question, yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking talk. I'm a master's student here interested in ecological art history. And then it seems to me that you're arguing that there's no definite differentiation between the self and other, between plastic and the human beings. And then it seems, for example, in the plastiglomerate, we're seeing the intersection of a natural time, which is represented by the rock, and then the human time, which is represented by plastic. So I'm wondering, are you suggesting an alternative time frame to look at plastic contamination, and even the wording contamination itself is problematic?
Yeah, that's a very nice question. I think, yes, I am looking at a time called plastic time. I'm looking at that because there is that earth time, the human time, the inhuman time. I mean, these are things that I mentioned, but there is also the plastic time. What I call this, very briefly to one example, just to explain this, what I mean by this plastic time here, it has a lot of explanation, of course. It's just not, please don't misread me here because I'm just giving you one instance here. But plastic time, I've written extensively on that, what exactly it means. But again, as I said, just answering to his question, that all things come from the material itself. Plastic is the material, so it's nothing to do with plasticity. I'm not looking into the philosophy of plasticity at this moment. One thing that I want to tell you here is that if you look at this rock, just an example of that, when one looks at that rock, there is the geological time, which you actually call the earth time. Then I say that there are certain things like this nylon rope or the toothbrush that gets indentured into the rock face. They are coming from a certain amount of time, certain kind of time, which you might say the human time, which you might say the quotidian time. From there, these things have come into the rock. But the interesting thing is, can you really in any way determine or in any way assess how exactly this happened? I mean, how exactly does this particular toothbrush actually got into the rock? Around what time? What was the temperature gradient? What was the weather effects? What was the earth pressure, the water pressure that actually made this particular toothbrush to get indentured in the face of the rock? Why? How did it happen? Did it happen really where everything came to place, where the rocks allowed it to happen, the toothbrush came around that time, there was a certain kind of temperature, there was certain kind of pressure. So all other environmental factors, how did they come together? This is something that scientists have not been able to find out. This is the indeterminate judgment about seeing how this rock actually got formed. And this is what I time the plastic time. Because the plastic time is about when there is a certain level of indeterminacy about how you see certain factors coming together to produce a kind of a consequence. That was the first one. And the second thing is that plastic teaches us, right, for instance, it changes the philosophy of death for us as well. Because if you look at plastic, then you would see that there are two things that come up of plastic. One is the plasticity of plastic, and the other is the non-plasticity of plastic. Because the plastic that actually you throw, I mean, if whatever the plastic wrapper that we're using when getting chocolates there, I mean, if you throw that, that's going to outlive you by 400 years. So the problem is that how do you then determine your relationship with time? Is it that there is something that you are mortified to believe that humans will probably be living for 80 years, but the material that you're using is outliving you by 400 years? So, and that particular material that you have thrown, a wrapper for instance, doesn't come back to you after 400 years as a wrapper. It comes back to you in a different shape, in a different form, in a different avatar. Definitely something that has a kind of a plastic genesis or a composition to it, but it's a different kind of formation, it's a different kind of identity with which it comes out. So how do you space out your relationship with the object? Like how actually you space out your relationship with the surroundings, the earthly milieu within which you are actually surviving. That is also another form of looking at non-plasticity of plastic as a way of expression of the plastic time as well.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very engaging and different talk from my background in science. It is really moving to think about the way how plastic changes our world, changes our humanity. And what I'm thinking is that when you look at the plastics, that you can see that they become part of our rocks and objects and surrounding us, but also the microplastic that in the air we breathe in, and in the water we drink, and in the food we eat. And now they are in every part of our body. Would that microplastic sap our humanity from inside out? And will you write a book like that? Thank you very much.
Well, again, I say that I would love to read a book. I would not write to like that book because I'm not qualified to write that. I can only say that this microplasticization of the human body, it has resulted in a new discipline in plastic studies called queer plastic. That is, what happens in a queer plastic is, as many researchers say about animals, who have found out in animals, that they are going through a kind of an endocrine glands blocker. They are disrupting the endocrine glands, resulting in a kind of a change in the sexual orientation of animals, where they have seen how male alligators, are actually changing their sexual identity because of this microplastic sink or microplastic seepage. And also, one thing that we are probably a little petrified by is that probably our medical science will be in some kind of jeopardy in the next 10 or 15 years, because we see that there has been almost a 15 microgram of plastic deposition in your body on every human being, and especially the salmon fish that I've been eating in my US lecture trip so far. I know that there is something inside a salmon which is getting into my body, but I couldn't resist myself. This is something that is leading me to a point where there can be a disease or an ailment that can spring a surprise to my body. And then medical science will not be able to determine how to really get to that, because we have certain methodologies, we have certain structures and procedures by which medical science looked at a certain human ailment. But an ailment that will spring almost like a plastiglomerate in our body, a fresh, a different, a wondrous kind of a disease about which medical science will have no answer for that. So that might be one of the reasons where microplastic or microplastic, you can call ingestion or assimilation or agglomeration of microplastic inside us. That might create a separate wonder for medical studies in the future. So
on that happy note,
yes.
That happy note, I think we're out of time. But thank you so much, and the questions were terrific, and I thought they did a lot to clarify this project. So thank you all for coming.